Historians zoom in on 1864 photo and discover what enslaved man was hiding on his wrist. The National Archives in Washington, D.C. processes thousands of Civil War-era photographs every year, many donated by families cleaning out attics or settling estates. Most are routine additions to the collection: soldiers in uniform, family portraits, landscapes of battlefields. But on a humid afternoon in August 2024, archivist Dr. Michael Torres opens a package that will lead to one of the most disturbing discoveries in his 15-year career. The donation comes from an estate sale in Louisville, Kentucky. The letter explains that the items belonged to the Henderson family, whose patriarch recently passed away at 98. Among his possessions was a collection of photographs dating back to the 1860s, carefully preserved in a cedar chest. The grandson thought the archives might be interested in the Civil War period images. Michael carefully removes a large albumen print from its protective sleeve. The photograph is remarkably well preserved, mounted on thick cardboard backing. A photographer's mark on the front reads, "Whitaker Studio, Louisville, Kentucky, September 1864. The image shows a formal family portrait in what appears to be a photographer's studio. Heavy, ornate curtains with tassels frame the left side. Decorative molding adorns the walls, and an elaborately carved Victorian chair sits at the center of the composition. 7 people are arranged in the photograph. On the left stands an elderly white man in his 60s, wearing a dark suit with a bow tie, his expression stern and commanding. Seated in the ornate chair at center is a woman wearing a long Victorian dress with elaborate lace trim and a decorative bonnet. Her face is composed but pale, her posture rigid. Around her are 4 children, 2 young girls standing in the center, one holding a small doll, and 2 young boys, one on each side. All are dressed in formal Victorian clothing, with high collars and careful grooming. Standing on the far right, separated from the white family by a noticeable gap, is a tall black man in his 30s. He wears a simple buttoned shirt and dark trousers, his clothing plain compared to the elaborate dress of the white family. His expression is carefully neutral, watchful in that way Michael recognizes from countless photographs of enslaved people, the studied blankness that came from living under constant surveillance and threat. The composition makes the racial hierarchy clear. This is a slave-holding family portrait that includes an enslaved man, displaying him as property alongside children and furniture as markers of wealth and status. Michael has catalogued hundreds of such photographs. They're painful historical documents that show how casually slavery was practiced and documented, how enslaved people were treated as possessions to be displayed in family portraits. But something about this particular photograph makes Michael pause and look more closely. He pulls out his magnifying glass and examines the image under his desk lamp. The enslaved man's hands are positioned in front of him, fingers loosely clasped. But as Michael looks closer, he notices something odd about the man's right wrist. There appears to be a mark there, partially obscured by the angle and shadow, but visible enough to see it's not just discoloration or a photographic artifact. Michael scans the photograph at high resolution and opens the image on his computer. He zooms in on the man's wrist and enhances the contrast. The mark becomes clearer. It's a wound, fresh and angry looking, the kind caused by restraints. But there's something else. What Michael initially thought was just the wound itself appears to have a pattern, as if something was pressed into the flesh repeatedly, leaving distinctive marks. He adjusts the image enhancement, and the pattern becomes unmistakable. The wounds on the man's wrist form letters, crude but deliberate, Murder. Michael sits back from his computer, his heart racing. Someone had carved the word murder into this man's wrist, and he had stood for a family portrait with that accusation literally marked on his body. Michael turns the photograph over. The back of the mounting board has an inscription written in faded ink. Henderson family, September 1864. Mr. Augustus Henderson, Mrs. Margaret Henderson, grandchildren Edward, Caroline, James, Alice, and Jacob. Jacob. The enslaved man had a name, though it's listed separately, almost as an afterthought. But there's something else written below the inscription in different handwriting, darker ink, added much later. Margaret died August 1864. This photo was taken September 1864. Look at Jacob's wrist. Michael reads the note 3 times. Margaret Henderson died in August 1864, but this photograph shows her alive, or apparently alive, in September 1864, a month after her death. How is that possible? And whoever wrote that note wanted someone to look at Jacob's wrist, wanted someone to notice the word carved there. Michael spends the rest of the day searching for information about the Henderson family. He finds census records, property deeds, and military records. Augustus Henderson had been a tobacco merchant in Louisville, wealthy enough to own 15 enslaved people in 1860. His son, the children's father, had died in 1862 fighting for the Confederacy, leaving the children in Augustus's care. Michael searches for death records and finds Margaret Henderson's death certificate, dated August 15, 1864. Cause of death listed as sudden illness. The attending physician was Dr. Samuel Wright. The informant who reported the death was Augustus Henderson. A month later, this photograph was taken, showing Margaret apparently alive and well, seated in the center of the family portrait. Something is very wrong. Michael contacts Dr. Lisa Washington, a historian at the University of Louisville who specializes in slavery in Kentucky. Lisa has spent years researching enslaved people's resistance and testimony, and she has connections with archives throughout the region. Lisa calls him back within 2 hours. "Send me everything you have. High-resolution images, the inscription, all of it. This sounds extraordinary." Michael emails the files, and they arrange to meet at the Filson Historical Society in Louisville, where Lisa has already requested Henderson family papers. That evening, Michael can't stop thinking about the photograph. He zooms in on Jacob's face, studying his expression. The careful neutrality, the watchfulness, but also something else, a kind of desperate awareness, as if he's trying to communicate something through his very presence in this photograph. And that word carved into his wrist. Murder. Who had carved it? Had Jacob done it to himself, marking his own body with an accusation he couldn't speak aloud? Or had someone else marked him as a warning, a threat, a claim of ownership over even his testimony about what he'd witnessed? Michael meets Lisa at the Filson Historical Society 3 days later. The archivist has pulled several boxes of Henderson family papers, business correspondence, household accounts, legal documents, and personal letters spanning from the 1850s through the 1880s. They divide the work. Lisa takes the personal letters, while Michael focuses on household records and account books. Within an hour, Lisa finds something that makes her call Michael over urgently. "Look at this. It's a letter from Augustus Henderson's sister, dated October 1864, 1 month after the photograph was taken." The letter reads, "Dearest Augustus, I received your letter regarding Margaret's passing, and I continue to be troubled by the circumstances. That you waited a full month before informing the family of her death is highly unusual. That you then commissioned a family portrait is even more peculiar. I understand your desire to have a final image of Margaret with her grandchildren. But, brother, the methods you employed to achieve this portrait disturb me greatly. To use a corpse in such a manner, even preserved as you describe, seems a violation of decency. And to force your Negro servant to participate in this charade under threat of violence. Augustus, I fear you have allowed your grief to drive you to actions that are both morally and legally questionable. I urge you to destroy that photograph and never speak of this matter again. The children must not know the truth of how that portrait came to be. Michael and Lisa stare at the letter in horror. A corpse, Michael says quietly. Margaret Henderson was dead when that photograph was taken. Augustus Henderson posed his dead wife's body with the family and forced Jacob to participate. Lisa searches through more letters and finds additional correspondence that fills in the terrible story. In a letter from Augustus to his lawyer, dated September 1864, he writes, "The matter with Margaret has been handled discreetly. Dr. Wright has provided preservative treatments that will maintain her appearance for the necessary time. The photographer has been paid handsomely for his cooperation and silence. The Negro Jacob understands the consequences of speaking about what he witnessed. The photograph will serve to document the family as Margaret would have wished, and none shall know the true circumstances of its creation." Michael finds more disturbing information in the household account books. There are payments to Dr. Wright for preservation services, payments to Whitaker Studio for special photographic session, and ominously, payments to someone listed only as Overseer Smith for discipline and restraint of property. They search for more specific information about Jacob and find him listed in Augustus Henderson's property records. Jacob had been purchased in 1858 from an estate sale valued at $100, assigned to household service. The records note he was literate despite laws forbidding education of Negroes and requires firm management. Lisa finds the most disturbing information in a diary kept by one of Augustus Henderson's neighbors, a woman named Sarah Mitchell, who recorded daily observations of Louisville society in the 1860s. In an entry from August 1864, she writes, "Terrible news from the Henderson household. Margaret Henderson has died, quite suddenly. The circumstances are whispered about, but not spoken plainly. Some say she fell down the stairs. Others suggest she was ill for days before her death. Most troubling are the rumors about screaming heard from the Henderson house the night before Margaret's body was discovered. Augustus claims she died in her sleep, but the servants tell a different story. They say there was a violent argument, that Augustus was in a rage about money Margaret had hidden from him, that terrible sounds came from the bedroom that night. The Negro servant, Jacob, found Margaret's body in the morning and raised the alarm. But by then it was too late. Dr. Wright ruled the death accidental, but many doubt this conclusion. Augustus Henderson is a powerful man, and Dr. Wright is in his debt. I fear justice will not be served." Augustus Henderson murdered his wife, Lisa says with certainty, and Jacob witnessed it, or found evidence of it, or knew the truth somehow. And Augustus forced him to participate in creating a photograph with the corpse to cover up what really happened. Michael searches through more documents and finds a statement taken by a Union provost marshal in December 1864, 3 months after the photograph. By late 1864, Union forces controlled Louisville, and they were investigating various crimes committed by Confederate sympathizers. Among the statements is one from a man identified as Jacob Henderson, Negro, formerly enslaved by Augustus Henderson. "My name is Jacob. I was owned by Mr. Augustus Henderson of Louisville until I escaped to Union lines in November 1864. I wish to testify about a murder that occurred in Mr. Henderson's household in August of that year. On the night of August 14th, 1864, I was sleeping in the basement of the Henderson house, where the Negro servants were kept locked at night. I was awakened by sounds of screaming and violence from the upstairs bedrooms. I heard Mrs. Margaret Henderson crying out for help, and I heard Mr. Augustus Henderson shouting in rage. The sounds continued for some time, then went silent. In the morning, I was unlocked and called upstairs to attend to the family as usual. When I entered Mrs. Henderson's bedroom to bring her morning water, I found her lying in her bed, clearly dead. Her neck was at an unnatural angle, and there were bruises on her throat that looked like finger marks. I went immediately to find Mr. Henderson, who was in his study. When I told him that Mrs. Henderson appeared to be dead, he showed no surprise. He went to view the body, then summoned Dr. Wright, who was his friend and business associate. Dr. Wright examined the body and declared that Mrs. Henderson had died of natural causes in her sleep. But I had seen the bruises, had heard the violence the night before. I knew this was murder, not natural death. Mr. Henderson kept me confined to the house after that day. He told me that if I spoke to anyone about what I had seen or heard, he would sell my wife and children south to the cotton plantations, where they would die of overwork. My family was enslaved on a farm outside Louisville, and Mr. Henderson had the power to make good on his threat. For a month, Mr. Henderson kept me locked in the basement at night and under constant watch during the day. He had Mrs. Henderson's body treated with preservatives by Dr. Wright, who claimed it was to prepare her for burial, but the burial never came. Instead, in September, Mr. Henderson announced we would have a family photograph made. He had Mrs. Henderson's preserved body, dressed in her finest clothes, and positioned in a chair. He arranged the grandchildren around her, told them their grandmother was merely unwell, and they must be very still and quiet. He ordered me to stand in the photograph as well. When I hesitated, he had Overseer Smith beat me and chain me in the basement for 2 days without food or water. When they released me, Mr. Henderson told me I would stand for the photograph, or my family would be sold south that very day. I stood for the photograph. Mrs. Henderson's dead body was propped in the chair beside living children who did not know their grandmother was a corpse. The photographer knew. I could see it in his face. But he had been paid to keep silent. Before the photograph was taken, I used a piece of metal I had hidden to carve a word into my wrist where it would be visible in the image. I carved the word murder. I knew that photograph would exist as evidence, that someday someone might look closely and see what I had marked on my own body, the truth that I could not speak aloud. After the photograph, Mr. Henderson finally allowed Mrs. Henderson to be buried. He told everyone she had died in September, not August, and showed the photograph as proof she had been alive and well with the family shortly before her death. I planned my escape carefully. In November, when the Union Provost Marshal established offices in Louisville, I saw my chance. I escaped during the night and reached Union lines. My family had already been sold south in October. Mr. Henderson sold them anyway, out of spite or suspicion that I might try to flee. I make this statement so that the truth will be recorded. Augustus Henderson murdered his wife Margaret Henderson on the night of August 14th, 1864. He forced me to participate in creating a false photograph showing her alive a month after her death. He threatened my family to ensure my silence. And he has faced no justice for his crime because he is a wealthy white man and I was his slave. I do not know if this statement will lead to his prosecution, But I want the truth recorded so that someday, when someone looks at that photograph, they will know what it really shows. Not a family portrait, but evidence of murder and the lengths a guilty man will go to cover his crime. Michael and Lisa sit in silence after reading Jacob's testimony. The provost marshal's notes indicate that an investigation was opened, but Augustus Henderson used his connections to have the charges dismissed. Jacob's testimony, as an escaped slave, was not admissible in court against a white man under Kentucky law, even under Union military authority. Augustus Henderson faced no consequences for murdering his wife or for forcing Jacob to participate in the grotesque photograph. Jacob carved murder into his own wrist so it would be visible in the photograph, Lisa says, her voice shaking with emotion. He marked his body with the truth because it was the only testimony he could give that might survive. Michael looks at the photograph again, seeing it completely differently now. The woman in the chair isn't alive. She's a corpse, carefully preserved and dressed, propped up for a family portrait. The children standing around her don't know they're posing with their dead grandmother. And Jacob, standing apart on the right, has carved an accusation into his wrist that would be documented forever in this image. We need to find out what happened to Jacob after his testimony, Michael says, and we need to find out if he was ever reunited with his family. They search through Freedmen's Bureau records, looking for any trace of Jacob Henderson in the years after the war. For weeks, they find nothing. Jacob seems to have vanished after giving his testimony in December 1864. Then Lisa finds something in the records of the American Missionary Association, a group that established schools for freed people throughout the South after the war. In their 1866 records from New Orleans, there's a note about a teacher named Jacob Henderson who had traveled to Louisiana searching for his family, who had been sold south in 1864. The note reads, "Jacob Henderson, formerly enslaved in Louisville, has been searching throughout Louisiana for his wife Dinah and children Samuel and Mary, sold to cotton plantations in 1864. After 18 months of searching, Mr. Henderson located his wife in Baton Rouge, working as a laundress. She informed him that their son Samuel died of fever in 1865, but their daughter Mary survived and is working on a plantation near Natchez. Mr. Henderson has departed for Natchez to continue his search. His determination to reunite his family, despite all obstacles, is a testament to the strength of familial bonds that slavery sought to destroy, but could not." Michael and Lisa continue searching and find one more reference to Jacob, this time in census records from 1870. In Natchez, Mississippi, the census lists a Jacob Henderson, age 42, working as a carpenter, residing with his wife Dinah Henderson, age 38, and daughter Mary Henderson, age 15. "He found them," Lisa says, tears streaming down her face, "after everything, the murder he witnessed, the forced participation in that horrible photograph, the threats, the escape, his family being sold south. He found them, and they rebuilt their lives together." Michael finds one final document that brings Jacob's story full circle. In 1880, Jacob Henderson testified before a congressional committee investigating conditions for freed people in the South. His testimony includes a reference to his experiences in slavery. "I witnessed a murder committed by my enslaver, and I was forced to participate in covering up that crime. I marked my own body with the truth because it was the only testimony I could give at the time. Even after I escaped and told my story to Union authorities, my testimony was not believed because I was a Negro, and my enslaver was a white man. That photograph exists somewhere, and carved on my wrist in that image is the word murder. Evidence of a crime that was never prosecuted, truth that was never accepted, justice that was never served. But I survived, and I found my family, and I stand here today as a free man to testify that slavery was not just forced labor, but a system that protected white violence and silenced black testimony, even about the most serious crimes. Michael and Lisa work with genealogists to trace Jacob Henderson's descendants. They discover that Jacob and Dinah had more children after reunification, and their descendants are scattered throughout the South and Midwest. One of them, Reverend James Henderson, is a retired minister living in Louisville, the same city where Jacob had been enslaved and where he had witnessed murder. Michael calls Reverend Henderson, his heart pounding. "Reverend Henderson, my name is Dr. Michael Torres from the National Archives. I've been researching your great-great-grandfather Jacob Henderson, and I've discovered some remarkable documents about his experiences in slavery, including a photograph where he carved the word murder into his wrist as testimony about a crime he had witnessed." There's a long pause. "The photograph," James Henderson says slowly. "I've heard family stories about a photograph where Jacob marked himself, but we never had a copy, never saw it. We knew Jacob witnessed something terrible, that he escaped during the war, that he searched for years to find his family. But we never had documentation, just stories passed down. I have the photograph," Michael says. "I have Jacob's testimony to Union authorities about the murder he witnessed. I have documents showing how he searched for his family and eventually found them. Would you like to see them?" Reverend Henderson travels to Washington the following week. Michael and Lisa meet him at the archives, and they spend the afternoon sharing everything they've discovered. James examines each document with the careful attention of someone learning the full truth about an ancestor whose story had been passed down in fragments. When he sees the photograph, his great-great-grandfather standing apart from the white family, the word murder carved into his wrist, documenting the truth that no one would believe from his testimony alone, James has to step away and compose himself. "We always knew Jacob was brave," he says quietly. "We knew he survived terrible things, that he never gave up looking for his family, that he lived to testify about what he endured. But I never understood the full scope of what he faced. To witness a murder, to be forced to stand in a photograph with a corpse, to mark his own body because it was the only testimony he could give, and then to survive all that and still have the strength to search for his family for 18 months until he found them." Michael shows him Jacob's congressional testimony, the documents about his search for his family, the census record showing Jacob, Dinah, and Mary reunited in Natchez. "Jacob didn't just survive," Lisa says. "He fought. He marked his body with truth when speech was too dangerous. He escaped when he had the chance. He searched until he found his family. And he testified publicly about what he had witnessed, even though it brought no justice. He made sure the truth was recorded." James nods, overwhelmed with emotion. "My grandfather used to say that Jacob taught our family to speak truth, even when it's dangerous, even when no one wants to hear it. Now I understand what he meant. Jacob carved truth into his own body and made sure it was photographed. He spoke truth to Union authorities, even when they wouldn't prosecute the murderer. He testified before Congress, even when no justice would result. He insisted on truth-telling as an act of resistance and dignity." Michael then asks the question he's been planning. "Reverend Henderson, I'd like to create an exhibition about Jacob's story, about bearing witness to white violence, about the courage required to testify when your testimony isn't believed, about survival and family reunification after slavery. Would you be comfortable with that? James looks at him with fierce determination. Not just comfortable, I insist on it. This story needs to be told. People need to understand that enslaved people witnessed crimes constantly, that they carried knowledge of white violence, that they could never safely speak. Jacob found a way to speak through marking his own body, through preserving his testimony for the future. That courage needs to be honored. Michael and Lisa also try to find descendants of Augustus Henderson. They trace the family line and discover that the Henderson family remained prominent in Louisville for decades after the war. One descendant, Catherine Morrison, is a lawyer in Louisville who has been researching her family's history. Michael contacts her carefully, unsure how she'll react to learning that her ancestor murdered his wife and forced an enslaved man to participate in covering up the crime. Catherine agrees to meet, and Michael travels to Louisville to share the evidence. Catherine listens in silence as Michael explains. The murder, the preserved corpse, the forced photograph, Jacob's testimony, the way Augustus used his power to avoid prosecution. When Michael finishes, Catherine sits quietly for a long moment. My family always spoke of Augustus Henderson as a successful businessman who suffered losses during the war, she says finally. We knew he owned slaves, but that was presented as normal for the time. There were hints of scandal around his wife's death, whispered stories about suspicious circumstances, but nothing specific. I never imagined. She pauses, composing herself. I never imagined he murdered her, preserved her corpse for a photograph, and forced an enslaved man to participate while threatening his family. She looks at the photograph, at Augustus standing stern and commanding, at Margaret's dead body propped in the chair, at Jacob standing apart with murder carved into his wrist. But I'm not entirely surprised, she continues. I've been researching the Henderson family for years, and I've found enough evidence of violence, cruelty, and abuse of enslaved people to know that Augustus Henderson was not the respectable man family mythology claimed. And I've learned enough about slavery to understand that people like Jacob carried knowledge of white violence that they could never safely reveal. How do you feel about this becoming public? Michael asks gently. Catherine meets his eyes. It should be public. Augustus Henderson committed murder and used his power to avoid consequences. Jacob Henderson was forced to participate in covering up that crime, and then had his testimony dismissed because he was black. That truth needs to be told, even if it destroys my family's mythology about our distinguished ancestor. Justice may be 160 years late, but at least the truth can finally be acknowledged. 10 months later, the National Archives opens the exhibition, What the Enslaved Man Was Hiding on His Wrist, Jacob Henderson's Story. The exhibition occupies a prominent gallery, and lines form before doors open on the first day. The centerpiece is the 1864 photograph, displayed with dramatic lighting that draws attention to Jacob's wrist and the word murder carved there. A magnified detail view shows the letters clearly, leaving no doubt about what Jacob marked on his own body. Beside the photograph is Augustus Henderson's letter to his lawyer about handling Margaret's death and arranging the photograph. The exhibition explains the horrifying truth that Margaret Henderson's corpse was preserved and posed for a family portrait a month after her death to cover up her murder. The exhibition tells Jacob's complete story through documents, letters, and testimony. It explains how he witnessed or knew about the murder, how he was imprisoned and threatened to ensure his silence, how he carved murder into his wrist so it would be documented in the photograph, and how he eventually escaped and testified about what he had witnessed. One section focuses on the photograph itself and what it meant for Jacob to mark his body as testimony. Visitors can read about how enslaved people's testimony was legally inadmissible against white people in most circumstances, how black witnesses to white violence were routinely silenced, and how Jacob found a way to create permanent evidence that would survive even when his spoken testimony was dismissed. Another section follows Jacob's life after escape, his testimony to Union authorities, the search for his family sold south, the 18-month quest that ended in reunification, his work as a carpenter in Natchez, and his later testimony before Congress about the violence and injustice he had witnessed. A video plays continuously featuring Reverend James Henderson and other descendants sharing family stories about Jacob, explaining how his courage and determination influenced their family values, reflecting on what it means to descend from someone who insisted on speaking truth, even when it was life-threateningly dangerous. Catherine Morrison also participates, recording a video acknowledging her ancestors' crimes. Augustus Henderson murdered his wife and used his power to avoid justice, she says. He forced an enslaved man to participate in covering up that crime through threats and violence. He represents the way white supremacy protected white violence and silenced black testimony. Jacob Henderson represents the courage it took to resist that silencing, to speak truth when no one would listen, to mark your own body with evidence, because it was the only testimony that might survive. The exhibition also includes broader context about violence in slaveholding households, showing how enslaved people constantly witnessed crimes, but could rarely safely testify. It includes testimony from other formerly enslaved people about the violence they witnessed, legal documents showing how black testimony was excluded from courts, and information about the long struggle to make black voices count in the justice system. On opening day, Michael stands in the gallery, watching visitors engage with the exhibition. He sees people lean close to the photograph, studying Jacob's face and the word carved into his wrist. He sees them read his testimony with growing horror and admiration. He sees parents explaining to children what it means to bear witness when no one will believe you. Reverend James Henderson stands beside him, staring at his great-great-grandfather's image. Jacob was forced to stand in a photograph with a murdered woman's corpse and a murderer who threatened his family, he says quietly. But he found a way to turn that photograph into evidence. He marked himself with truth and made sure it was documented. That act of resistance, marking your own body with testimony when speech is too dangerous, that's extraordinary courage. A young black woman approaches them, tears in her eyes. "Thank you for this," she says. "I never knew that enslaved people had to witness violence and couldn't safely testify. Seeing what Jacob did, marking his own body because it was the only testimony he could give, it helps me understand the courage it took just to survive, let alone to resist." An elderly white man stops to talk to Catherine Morrison, who is volunteering as a docent. "My family was from Kentucky too," he says. "Looking at this makes me wonder what violence my ancestors committed, what crimes they witnessed or participated in. It's painful to ask those questions, but necessary." Throughout the day, visitors engage deeply with the exhibition, spending time with each document, watching the videos multiple times, sitting with the weight of what they're learning. The photograph that seemed to show a Victorian family with their servant reveals itself to be evidence of murder, forced participation, and the extraordinary courage of a man who marked his own body with truth when he had no other way to testify. As the museum prepares to close that evening, Michael walks through the gallery one more time. He stops in front of the photograph, looking at Jacob's watchful face, his rigid posture, the word murder carved into his wrist. The photograph had waited 160 years to reveal its full horror and its full courage. It had passed through generations, stored in a cedar chest, eventually making its way to Michael's desk through estate sale and donation. Now the photograph has fulfilled a purpose Jacob likely intended when he marked his body before stepping into the photographer's studio. The truth has been revealed. The murder has been acknowledged, even though justice was never served. And Jacob Henderson's courage, his refusal to stay silent, even when silence was the only safe option, has been documented and honored. The word murder, carved into a young man's wrist, changed everything. It preserved testimony that no one would believe when spoken. It survived when Jacob himself might have been killed for speaking. It waited more than a century to be noticed and examined and finally believed. As visitors file past the image one last time, seeing Jacob clearly for who he was, not a passive victim, but an active witness, not silent, but speaking through his marked body, not powerless, but finding power in the only testimony he could safely give. Michael thinks about all the other stories waiting to be discovered, all the other acts of witness hidden in photographs, all the other truths that enslaved people found ways to preserve even when their voices were legally silenced. Jacob Henderson's story has been told. His testimony, carved into his own body and photographed for posterity, has finally been heard and believed. And Michael is grateful to have played a part in ensuring that Jacob's courage, his determination to speak truth, and his refusal to be silenced are remembered and honored across the generations.